started right away because I'm sure that we're all excited about our speaker for today. You know most of the recent history of her, but what you may not know is that she's a homegirl. She's from Queens. A graduate of Jackson High School who went on to Radcliffe College and Yale Law School. She has an impressive list of academic credentials, professional and experiential things that she can share with us today. And what I found most important about all of it is that we had a very difficult time getting here. We started off, she had a late train, then they closed the Brooklyn Bridge. We drove around and around Lower Manhattan just trying to get from the Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn. She has a very warm spirit. She made us feel at ease. We were a lot more nervous and upset than she was. She's an all-around very good-spirited person. She's also the mother of a charming and delightful 6-year-old. And without further ado, I really don't want to say a lot about her because I think her record and she speak for herself better than I ever could. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, representing the Africana Resource Center, the Center for Women's Development, the Black History Month Committee, and the Women's History Month Committee. It's on my great honor and privilege to introduce Lani Guinier.
Did have a difficult time getting here. I've had some interesting experiences over the past 8 months, and many of them relate to leaving Philadelphia and arriving in other places. I was trying to leave Philadelphia a few months ago and trying to catch a taxi cab, and it was raining. Actually pouring rain, and it reminded me of New York, not Philadelphia, because people were being very rude to each other and trying to edge each other to hail the next cab coming down Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And all of a sudden, a taxi pulls up in front of me and stops. And the driver gets out, and he opens the door and he says, "The man inside wants to take you to the airport." Now, I did have suitcases with me and I was going to the airport. And I knew that as a result of my recent notoriety, many people recognized me, but I didn't know they could read my mind. So I looked inside of the cab, and I was hesitant. I was really torn because I did want to get to the airport, and it was hard to catch a cab. But I did not know who this person was inside of this taxi cab, and the driver picked up my bags and started putting them in the trunk of the car, and he said, "The man inside says he knows you." So I looked again, and I saw a gentleman dressed in a business suit, but there was no sign of recognition on my end, but he grinned broadly and said, "Zoe Baird." And I said no, but I'd still like a ride to the airport. Well, I've been called many things over the past year. As most of you know by now, I was dubbed early on Clinton's quota queen. You may not know, I was also the czarina of separatism. Or that U.S. News and World Report started an article about me while my nomination was pending, quoting some Democrats, among whom the joke was, and I quote, "strange name, strange hair, strange writings, she's history." But I think my personal favorite is one from the editor of the editorial page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is now my adopted hometown newspaper. I've never met him. He had never at the time read anything that I had written. And he said, and I quote, "If she testifies before the Senate, real America, capital R, capital A, will see her as a mad woman." With those kind of press notices, President Clinton responded like a good New Democrat. He held a press conference and announced his decision to withdraw my name as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Immediately thereafter, he retreated to a dinner party where, in my absence, he reportedly told the assembled guests that he loved me. He said, becoming once again now an old Democrat, "I just love her. If she needed $5,000, I would lend it to her, no questions asked, from my personal account." But while the president, whether as a new or old Democrat, trusted me as a person, he just couldn't give me authority to enforce his administration's civil rights policies. In his eyes, I could cash a check, but I could not hold check. Holding check is a term used by young men and women at Germantown High School in Philadelphia. And according to my neighbor who teaches there, holding check means to have influence, to be able to enforce a promise. Given the controversy surrounding my nomination, I could not hold check on civil rights. In a strange way, my nomination came to symbolize the state of denial in which we find ourselves on issues of civil rights in particular, but race in general. America has nothing against individual blacks. Americans support the advancement of individual black achievers. The president is committed to a cabinet that looks like America. The president will even lend some black friends money. But when it comes to discussing race, our policy comes close to the one on gays in the military. Don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue. Talking about race has become synonymous with violating the rules. It doesn't matter how quietly or carefully you speak, the policy is don't ask, don't tell. In the name of race neutrality, traditional Democrats do not want to talk about race anymore. Instead, they talk in loaded, coded euphemisms about drugs, about welfare, about crime. Republicans aren't supposed to talk about race anymore either, or about job training, or vote suppression campaigns, or universal health care. And new Democrats can't talk about anything that might alienate the Reagan Democrats. And therefore, race becomes the new four-letter word. This is why I was not allowed to speak for myself about my innovative ideas for ensuring that people of color have a voice, not just a vote. We seem to have forgotten that dialogue and intergroup communication are critical to forging consensus. I do not believe that avoiding controversy is the same thing as building consensus. Nor do I believe that talking about controversial issues is what creates controversy. For example, the controversy about race preceded my nomination. Talking did not exacerbate that controversy. Not talking did. Genuine debate was shut down by techniques of stereotyping and silencing. I was punished as the messenger reporting the bad news about our racial situation. I dared to speak when I should have been silent. They didn't ask, but I told. confirmation hearings is that I knew a Senate hearing was not just another daytime television talk show. Given the controversy my nomination had attracted, a Senate hearing would have been an unusual, proactive opportunity to turn the attention of the American people back to the unfinished agenda of civil rights. But that discussion must still occur. We have to move beyond the policy. We have to move beyond the state of denial. We have to move beyond don't ask, don't tell. What are the costs of this policy? Well, certainly my nomination was a casualty, but frankly, this was not about a job for me. I never gave up my day job. I have a job. In fact, unlike many other Black and brown people, unlike many Asian Americans, unlike many disabled people, unlike many women, unlike many poor people, I have a job for life. I am a tenured law professor. So this was not about how I was treated personally. It is about a country's fundamental obligation to its democratic values. Why should people who are ignored, who are disrespected, who are written out feel any commitment to work within the system? That is certainly one lesson of both recent scandals involving vote suppression in New Jersey and actual absentee vote fraud in Philadelphia. Many people now agree with Milagros Robledo, a Latino voter in Philadelphia, who says, and I quote, "I know now what my vote means. It means a lot to politicians. It means nothing to me." So ultimately, my nomination is a metaphor. It is simply a metaphor for the way many people of color and the issue of race and racism are viewed by too many other people in this society. My nomination has become history. But unfortunately, and more importantly, issues of civil rights and racial justice and fairness have been consigned to a similar fate. They once were important, but unless we want to be known as race-obsessed radicals, we are no longer permitted to discuss race in polite conversation, and certainly not in law review articles. Remember the policy: don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue. In so many ways, my nomination symbolized the perception gap between blacks and whites on issues of race and racism. We are letting others define us. We are letting the appearance of diversity pass for genuine diversity, and we are not talking about race. They don't ask, and we don't tell. The 1968 Kerner Commission was a bipartisan presidential advisory group that was formed by President Johnson to investigate the causes of urban unrest in the 60s. In 1968, the Kerner Commission found that the nation was rapidly moving toward two increasingly separate Americas, one white, one black. Within 2 decades, in 1968, the Kerner Commission predicted a white society principally located in the suburbs, in smaller central cities, and in the peripheral parts of large cities, and a black society concentrated right here within large central cities. Now, unfortunately, that was the prediction of the 1968 Kerner Commission, and that report is still news today because its lessons have not been learned. After the passage of 26 years and 7 presidents, the society remains just as the commission described: one nation divided. And just as Kerner predicted, blacks and whites are living today in what Newsweek magazine calls an icy détente, a world of perceptual dichotomies. Regardless of political ideology, there is a new form of separatism taking root. Today's barriers are cultural, experiential, and attitudinal. From politicians to media pundits to academic policymakers, we are all uncomfortable because we don't live together, we don't go to school together, and we don't talk to each other. Now, some of this discomfort simply reflects the polarization of the last 12 years, when we had two administrations whose national civil rights policy emphasized reverse discrimination, fed white fears of racial preferences, and discussed discrimination exclusively in terms of innocent victims and guilty perpetrators. They talked about everything in terms of who's to blame, who's guilty, and who is right and who is wrong. Everything was individual victims and individual perpetrators rather than an institutional or structural problem in which we all participate to some extent. Now, when civil rights enforcement is reduced to the identification of blameworthy individuals, it's not surprising that many resist its message. No one wants to be called names. And calling someone names does nothing to advance our collective interest in strengthening our mutual ability to participate in a global marketplace. Yet that was the explicit strategy of earlier Republican administrations who sought to polarize the debate. The head of the Civil Rights Division during Ronald Reagan's term was William Bradford Reynolds. He wrote a memo. William Bradford Reynolds wrote a memo in 1988, in February of 1988, in which he spelled out Ronald Reagan's civil rights policy. And I quote, "We must polarize the debate. We must not seek consensus. We must confront." And so we suffer the results of that policy, in which we are afraid even of talking to each other. Remember the policy: don't ask, don't tell. On the other hand, some of the discomfort about racial dialogue reflects real shifts in the public mood about affirmative action, about violent crime, and about the need for continued government intervention once formal barriers to equal opportunity are struck down. But some of this discomfort simply masks racial bias across the political spectrum. A recent study of the National Science Foundation found that liberal and conservative whites are almost equally willing to express negative characterizations about blacks. 45% of white liberals and 51% of white conservatives agreed that blacks are aggressive or violent. 44% of the conservatives and 41% of the liberals said blacks are boastful. Now, much of this bias reflects, as I said, the absence of any honest dialogue about race across racial and ethnic groups who, despite fundamentally consistent background equivalencies, live fundamentally different and separate lives. Part of the problem, as I said, is we're not talking to each other. And part of the problem is that when blacks experience discrimination, they don't talk about it. A recent book by Ellis Coase called The Rage of a Privileged Class describes why many college-educated, middle-class blacks don't talk about their experiences. They are afraid of being punished twice. First, for being black. Second, for being angry. People are embarrassed, they're ashamed, and they're afraid. There's a story recently about a black judge in New Jersey who was arrested for using a fraudulent credit card in a Bloomingdale's. He protested his innocence, but the white clerk, the white security guard, the white police officer, and the white prosecutor all were willing to assume the worst about this black judge. when he was handcuffed in the Bloomingdales and taken to the police station, the white police officer said he was flabbergasted. This is the police officer's own word. He was flabbergasted because this black man kept saying he had never been handcuffed before. And this police officer said, "I have never met a black man who's not been arrested before." Now, the judge ultimately was exonerated, but not before, as I said, he was arrested, he was charged with a crime, and he was suspended from the bench. Yet he didn't talk about this story because he was initially, he said, willing to attribute it to an innocent mistake. Except that this innocent mistake kept getting repeated over and over and over by the different people within the system that he kept coming into contact with. And he finally concluded that there was still unfortunate truth in the old cliche. What do you call a white man with $1 million? A millionaire. What do you call a black man with $1 million? A nigger with $1 million. Now, if you think that's an isolated experience, and I'm sure you don't, I had a young woman call me recently looking for an attorney. A very attractive, professional woman, also arrested for shoplifting, this time in a TJ Maxx's in Montgomery County outside of Philadelphia. She had bought a pair of sunglasses which broke the day that she took them home. And she went back to the store to exchange them and went to the clerk and showed the clerk the broken glasses. And the clerk said, "There's the bin. Go take your broken glasses with you to the bin and replace them and make sure you get the same identical pair," which is what she did. She went back to the clerk and gave back the broken sunglasses and started to walk out of the store and was arrested for shoplifting by the security guard. And not only was she arrested, but she was also prosecuted and was looking for an attorney. And this was several weeks after the incident, and she broke down on the phone crying. She started to cry because she told me she was so ashamed of what had happened to her, she hadn't even told her own mother. So we have people experiencing discrimination who are too ashamed to talk about it. And as a result, their experiences remain invisible to the vast majority of whites who continue to enjoy amiable assumptions about racial progress. Whereas only 8% of college-educated blacks feel things got better in the last 10 years, a majority of whites think things got better in the last 10 years. So the experiences of many black people remain invisible. On the other hand, many whites don't want to talk about their own experiences or perceptions because they're afraid of being labeled a racist. And as I said, no one wants to be called names. I can tell you that from my own personal experience. Now, 25 years ago, the Kerner Commission called for national action in 3 areas: improving equal opportunity, addressing the plight of the disadvantaged, and increasing communication across racial lines. Improving equal opportunity, addressing the plight of the disadvantaged, and increasing communication across racial lines. To the extent we have done anything, and we haven't done much, but to the extent we've done anything about the Kerner Commission objectives, we focused on the first 2: formal equal opportunity and formally addressing the plight of the disadvantaged. But what about the third, changing attitudes? Ironically, our failure to create new attitudes or to overcome polarization helps account for a sense of paralysis that we are now experiencing, in which too many of us believe that the problems defy solution, or that the solutions are the problem. A nation of laws, we like to believe that when they are changed, attitudes will change along with them. This is naive. Anna Quinlan is a reporter for the New York Times, and she has talked to many college campuses and finds that in those college campuses, she is often faced by young white men who are also angry, who have also found their own reason to hate. She reports, for example, about a young white man who rises and asks about the future. What, he wants to know, can it possibly hold for him when most of the jobs, most of the good positions, most of the spots in professional schools are being given to women, and most especially to blacks? The worried young white man has internalized the newest myth of American race relations, and it has made him bitter. It is called affirmative action. All good things in life, he has learned, from college admission to executive positions, are being given to black citizens. And the verb is critical, given. Never mind that you can walk through the offices of almost any big company and see a sea of white faces. Never mind that with all that has been written about preferential treatment for minority law students, only about 7,500 of the 127,000 students enrolled in law school last year were African American. Never mind that there are more black men in prison than in college. Never mind that for some black men, prison has become a rite of passage. Never mind that only 3% of the doctors in this country are black. And never mind that many of our young people still suffer the secrets of racism. Now, 40 years ago, when Thurgood Marshall challenged segregation in the cases leading up to Brown versus Board of Education, he was crusading to overcome and to expose the secrets of racism, what he called stigmatic injury, or the psychological wounds of separate but equal. He was not so much worried about whether black children were sitting next to white children so that they could learn. He was worried that the doctrine of separate but equal was conveying a message to young black children that they are not equal. He was crusading for black self-esteem. It was a problem demonstrated 40 years ago by Kenneth Clark's doll experiments, where he showed young black kids two sets of dolls, a black doll and a white doll, and asked them which doll was pretty. And they picked the white doll. That was 40 years ago. I just read about a comparable experience that took place during February of 1994, Black History Month. A white teacher in Montgomery, Maryland, showed his 6th grade class a film based on a Langston Hughes short story about a young black boy who steals an elderly black woman's purse, and she then takes him in and changes him, smothering him with love and affection. And when the lights came on, the teacher asked the students what they thought of the film and what they thought the message of the film was. This was a class of 29 students. All but 2 of them were black or Latino. This was a class of 29 students. All but 3 of them were eligible to receive a free lunch. One of the best students in the class, an A student, a young black boy in the 6th grade class, raised his hand and he said this was the message of the film, and I quote, "You knew something bad was going to happen when it started. As soon as you see a black boy, you know he's gonna do something bad." The teacher, just because he's black, he's bad? The student, everybody knows that black people are bad. That's the way we are. The teacher was horrified and asked, how many students in the class agree? 24 of the 29 students in the class raised their hands. Black people are bad. So the teacher, still trying to figure this out, this white teacher in Montgomery, Maryland, said, well, are you using the word bad to mean cool or tough or hot? Or do you mean not good? Not good was the teacher then spent several sessions talking to the students, and he concluded that for these students, being bad was not seen as a matter of choice, and it was not seen as a matter of their upbringing. They saw it as a racial attribute. And within this paradigm of what they are, the teacher said they were very good at being bad. Some were excellent. What the teacher found is that the badder these kids were, the greater their social status. They had found a way to deal with success on their own terms. These students in 1994 carry within them the secret of racism, and it has led them to harbor doubts about themselves. And so the chasm widens. Thus, the key lesson of my nomination is that if we are going to move forward together as a society united to forge a common destiny, we first must commit to start talking. We must start talking and listening to people who are unlike ourselves. We must speak out and say that the appearance of formal equality, the fact that we don't have laws on the books that announce separate but equal, does not mean that we are all now equal. We are different in critical ways, the most important of which is that we often use the same language, but we mean very different things. We may all think of ourselves as Americans, but as I said, we don't live next to each other, we don't go to school together, and we certainly don't talk to each other. Now, there's some politicians who are willing to talk, and there are even some white politicians who are willing to engage in honest talk. One of those politicians is Bill Bradley. When he played for the New York Knicks, according to Sam Roberts, a reporter, Bradley proved that some white men can jump. But according to Roberts, when it comes to discussing race, most run. Bradley, however, does not run. He candidly confronts the dilemma. After the LA riots, he declared, and I quote, "When politicians don't acknowledge that just as slavery was our original sin, so race remains our unresolved dilemma, they cannot lead us out of crisis." Or even more to the point, Bradley asks, when is the last time any of you had a conversation about race with a person of another race? With the help of politicians and other leaders, we can support the important work of open dialogue. We may feel uncomfortable with such honest talk, but our common destiny depends upon it. Now, certainly it's difficult to have a public debate, and it's certainly difficult to have a public debate about race, especially when, as Professor Cornel West tells us, public life itself has been gutted. We've lived in a period of the Reagan-Bush years in which the private has been cast as sacred, and public life in general has been evacuated. Think of public education. Think of public transportation. Think of public health care. Think of public provisions, and they're usually associated with black and brown people, and they're associated in people's minds with squalor. So you get a withdrawal and a retreat from public life. One of the ways in which we've retreated from public life is that we have lost the art or the ability to have a meaningful public conversation. Most public conversation takes the form of name pointing and name calling and finger pointing. That's certainly what happened to me. Current public debate is little more than posturing. As the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, who's now the chair of the National Endowment for Humanities, says, in this kind of argument, one is either right or wrong, for them or against them, a winner or a loser, and there's no conversation. What we have instead is drive-by debate. Now, this may be good entertainment, but it is a disservice to the American people. So I say all of us have to start talking and speaking out. We need to learn how to ask. We need to learn how to tell. And most important, we need to learn how to listen. Some schools, for example, are experimenting with conversation as a way to avoid escalating fights and violence. Some high school students, for example, are learning to call time out or squash it when things get tense. They are learning to talk out their hostilities rather than act on them soundbite style. I didn't get a hearing. I didn't get a chance to talk. But with the help of people of goodwill, we can ensure that other voices are heard. Even if they don't ask, we must tell. But when we talk, we need not speak from hatred. We can be survivors, not victims. We can take the moral high ground. I appear here, for example, proudly as a woman with an issue, not a grievance. I am not a victim seeking sympathy. I am a democratic idealist who is committed to make America live up to its own democratic ideals. So we can work together to change the policy from don't ask, don't tell, to ask, and we shall tell. We shall speak proudly and without bitterness, but we shall tell. Thank you very much.
And this is the opening event in the college's celebration of Women's History Month. Do stop by the center, the second floor in this building to get the complete calendar of all of the events. The national theme for this month is In Every Generation, Action Frees Our Dreams. It's a beautiful theme and it's something to think about. Will you be the one? In every generation, action frees our dreams. And certainly in the Women's Center, we talk about the fact that we are not women with grievances. We are women with issues about rights that have to be corrected. So we really appreciate the lecture. We really appreciate folks coming out to hear it. And we'll spend just a brief time having questions for Professor Guinier. First question. And I do want to recognize her family. It was my privilege to meet the professor's family. We'd like for you to stand up, the wonderful aunts. Questions? It's Professor Rob.
Yes, it's just a comment. The phrase, strange hair, strange name, strange future, history, it seems to me it's a good example of the trivial, ridiculing, non-serious way that the country is responding to a very important issue. Rather than deal with it in a way that's going to bring a responsible response, they bring up something ridiculous. Your hair is not strange, your views are not strange, and you're not history.
Yes, Dr. Jackson.
First of all, thank you for coming in such concept this afternoon and becoming a part of our history. Our history in the most positive sense in terms of creating new messages and spreading them in a very vocal way. So thank you. Just a question about the anecdote you shared with regard to the event that occurred this past month full class? What was the age level?
6th grade.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Day.
How we should ask and talk about racism. How do we go about speaking to those who don't want to hear racism?
Okay, the question is, how would we go about speaking to those people who don't want to listen? One of the things that I have found most interesting in my research, and I study political participation, is that if you control for income, black people vote at a higher rate than whites. That is, poor blacks vote more than poor whites, middle class blacks vote more than middle class whites. But what we don't do is we don't do anything after we vote. So we think if we get out to the polls on election day and cast a ballot, that we have performed our civic duty. So what we don't do, we don't write letters to the editor of the paper. We don't write letters to our Congress people or our council people. We don't call up the television station when they have a show that we don't like. We don't participate in the public debate. And as a result, you see a very skewed view of who we are and what we think. So one of the things that I say we have to do is to start writing letters to the editor, start writing pieces for publication. Even if they don't get published in the newspaper, you have a record of what happened that you may be able to rely on 6 months later if something else happens that's similar. You're keeping an account, a journal of what's going on that you can then document, and perhaps your second letter will get published. Well, okay, one of the things I would say to you, even though you don't want to stand up,
Stand up.
it's important for other people to try to hear what you're saying. And it's a lot easier if you can stand. Oh. Okay, we'll come back to you.
On this side.
Oh, here, see, there's a microphone if you want to come up to the mic.
Yes, I've got a comment and a question. And in pre-slavery times, the question of the color line was notably absent. And I wonder if, as a people, aren't we guilty of buying into racism by going along with the perpetrator and using color terms as descriptions for ourselves?
Okay, good, sir.
What do you mean using color?
Okay, like
I'm dark skinned, she's black?
no, like we use the term, like you know, people would say, people would look at me and say I am black, or look at someone like her and say she's white. Wherein which, to me, white is not a color. White means the absence of color, and black is the essence from which all colors come. So when we call each other black and white, we are buying into racism, and we are fanning the flame of racism. Virtually.
There's certainly some truth to what you're saying. The part of what you're saying that I find the most interesting, in my experience, is that most white people don't think that they have a race. When they talk about race, they're talking about other people. They're not talking about them as also having a race. So in that sense, perhaps you're right, that the words that we're using are contributing to the illusion that only black people have a race, and therefore when we're talking about racism or race relations, we're only talking about blacks.
Might I add that I would like to throw the challenge to the establishment in my humblest way, so that if we can have a moratorium on the use of such words, I think we are bound to see an improvement in race relations.
What would you prefer to use?
People. Okay, you know, what I would say is this. There's a very interesting article that I saw recently in the New York Newsday. It was about this police officer who had married another police officer, and she was engaged in some struggle here in Brooklyn, and she, in which 3 young men were allegedly shot or something like that. I read that article, and there was not an iota of words that pertain to race in that article. Why can't all news reports be done in such a manner? You know, the media is very culpable in this thing about race, because they help to fan the flames of racism where they see it fit.
Sometimes you don't have to use words, you can still convey the same message. And television, which uses pictures, is a much more common form of communication for many people. I think part of what we have to do in terms of making sure that the whole picture is shown, which is what I assume you're also interested in, is to diversify the decision makers who are deciding what pictures to put on the news. It's not just enough to have people of color or different people in front of the camera. It is also very important to have a diversity of viewpoint and a diversity of perspective behind the camera who is making a decision as to what is, quote, news.
Thank you very much.
She's standing.
What can we as parents do to ensure that, because I don't believe that any of those parents support their children's death. So what is it we can do to counter that impression that they grow up with from wherever they are getting it from?
There are lots of things that all of us can do. The theme of my talk today is that we have to start taking more responsibility for the images and for the discussion that they are being subjected to. These kids are learning from television, and what they are seeing on television is teaching them that black people are bad. And it's not just television. Television in some ways is just mirroring the larger society. So we have to be active and responsible, not only for the messages that are going out, but for telling the, quote, decision makers where we think that the decisions are being made that are unfair or irresponsible or in some ways just racially discriminatory.
I understand, I do agree with, but when I say what can we do, I am very encouraging to my children what they want and they will want, the information that they have. But as a single parent, my children are out of my hands 12 hours a day, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. when I get to bed. In that interim, though, they are in a lot of places where you say we don't talk about it. Well, at 10 and at 8, my 3 hours in the morning and at night saying to them, you know, that's not enough.
Right.
Encourage them to make
Right. What I'm saying,
sure that they
right. What I'm saying to you is what you're doing is very important as an individual parent with your individual children, but you also have a responsibility as a citizen to speak up and to participate, for example, in the Parent-Teacher Association or in monitoring what's happening in your child's class and in what's happening in the larger society, because those are the images that are defining the psyche of our young people.
I have a question. What about us as parents? My son goes to school and he's in a black public school. And right now he's been discriminated against because he's a smart child among his own color. What are we as parents to do to teach our children that between ourselves we are not to be racial and discriminated against? What are we supposed to do? I'm fighting at home right now between me and him. Telling him, sweetheart, it's nice to be a smart kid, and education is the game right now for a black child, because the only thing out there for them is the jail. What are we as parents supposed to do? I'm fighting this right now as a black single parent. And I need some answers. What am I supposed to do?
I don't have the answer, but I'm glad that you're standing up and asking the question. And there may be other people in this room who have some suggestions, who have some answers. And part of what I'm saying is that we have got to start talking about these problems as opposed to just sort of bearing them silently.
That's it. You know, I go to my son's school, and the white teacher, all she can say to me, I have nothing against white nor black. All she can say to me, my son is being bad, but she's not looking in his school to say he's a smart child. Every child has to be a child. You have to grow up. You know, you have to grow up. Regardless of what the other is, or where you come from.
We'll keep fighting.
Let me also say that, of course, the college has some wonderful resources, and I see Martha from the Parent Trade Center, Parent Trade Program, and that program works around these issues. And so if you stop by our center, we can give you some information and some referrals about these issues. The thing is to move it from the isolationist stance.
Let me just again invite everyone. Regent Adelaide Sanford will be here on Saturday, March 12th, to talk to parents about these issues. Also, Esmeralda Simmons, Esquire, who is the director of the Center for Law and Social Justice of Medgar Evers College, is the newest Board of Education member. She is making opportunities available for parents of this city to come to the board. She maintains an open door policy. We want to see you down at the hall of the board on the 3rd Wednesday of every month. Y'all come.
I know that you were here with Clarence Thomas.
Yes.
And I'm aware of some of his views on affirmative action. However, what I want to ask you is, I guess my question is, does it need modification of policy? Because there are African Americans who are at school and who have gone to school who have accomplished what they accomplished because of their innate ability, right? But people perceive that as you're here because of affirmative action. And I think that some African Americans then begin to feel, well, I don't want to be the recipient of this because people see me in a certain way. And I want to ask you, I just want to ask
I'll repeat her question.
my question,
I'll try.
My question to you is, where do you stand in relationship to what Clarence Thomas represents? Because you were all there together.
Okay, the question is, where do I stand in relationship to Clarence Thomas? Clarence Thomas and I were classmates at Yale Law School. And in fact, at Yale Law School, we were friends. What happened to the friendship? Well, I think the question really is what happened to Clarence Thomas? The substance of the question is where do I stand in relationship to Justice Thomas on the issue of affirmative action, because some of you may know that Justice Thomas, even though he was the beneficiary of an affirmative action plan to get into Yale Law School, has now said publicly, or at least prior to his confirmation, that he was opposed to most affirmative action, although if you listen to his hearings, he is not opposed to affirmative action for college or law school admissions. He's opposed to affirmative action for employment. Now, my views and Justice Thomas's views are very, very different. But that's not to say that I also don't think we might benefit from re-examining some of our positions on affirmative action. And this is what I mean. I think in some ways that affirmative action has left us vulnerable for the claim that we are seeking special treatment or special preferences, when we actually have, I believe, a much more substantive and a much more serious claim to be making. And the larger claim that I think we should be pressing is that the rules that are being used to admit anybody are unfair. So it's not that we're asking for a special dispensation from an unfair set of rules. I think we should be saying, change the rules to make the rules fair. And the reason I say the rules are unfair, the particular area in which I have the most personal experience is law school admissions. I'm on the admissions committee for the University of Pennsylvania Law School. The admissions committee uses the LSAT, the law school admissions test, to admit a huge percentage of the class. This is a standardized test, just like the SAT, that is administered in a 3-hour or particular timed period, and then people use that to decide who should go to law school. Now, why do they use the LSAT to determine who should go to law school? They use the LSAT because it is efficient. You don't have to read all of the applications of all of these students to make the hard judgment who should be admitted. Because most admissions officers, if they are really honest, will tell you that 80% of the people who apply to the school are qualified. Qualified meaning they can do the work and graduate. So why are we using the LSAT? Because we don't have to have a lot of faculty sitting there and making decisions as to who we should be granting this opportunity to. Now, is the LSAT correlated with anything that we care about? Does the LSAT predict who is going to be an excellent lawyer? No. Does the LSAT predict who is going to be an excellent law student? Does the LSAT predict who is going to do well in the first year of law school? 18% is the highest correlation they can come up with between performance on the LSAT and performance in your first year of law school. That means 82% of your ranking class is unexplained by your performance on the LSAT. And yet we still use the LSAT, and people still think that if they do well on the LSAT, that somehow tells something about their entitlement to a legal education. So I say we should be re-examining the criteria that we use to admit everybody. And we should be deciding as a society, who do we think should be going to law school? What kind of lawyers as a society do we want? Do we want people who just can perform well on a pencil and paper test, or do we want people who are going to be socially active? Do we want people who are going to be professionally responsible? Do we want people who may be very good oral advocates? And maybe we want some people who write very well. And maybe we want some people who can negotiate. There are lots of different qualities that we may want in lawyers. And yet we use one single, ineffective measure because it is efficient. So my view is it's not about having a special preference or dispensation so that we don't have to be judged by this LSAT. I don't think anybody should be using the LSAT to determine law school admissions. I think, now other people may have a different view as to what the admissions process should be, and I think we should have a debate about it. And then we should decide how we can admit a diverse class that will lead to a better society for all of us. Because after all, going to law school is not an entitlement, it's an opportunity. And we should be very careful about who we give that opportunity to. That's my view.
I'm next.
I won't recognize you if you don't stand, because I don't see well. Fine. Okay.
We have to thank you to you, but I would like you to realize that Mrs. Clinton was at Kings County Hospital yesterday. You know that, of course you do. And Mrs. Clinton was not given the type of tour that should have been given to Kings County Hospital from a person like her. But what I really wanted to let you know is Kings County Hospital, there's a rumor going around that they're going to merge with Down School. Students of this facility, you know, the education facility, you may not have medical insurance. A lot of people don't. And if it emerges, it's a private hospital,
graduate, I'll get a better job, I'll have insurance, medical. You don't know what is going to happen. So I think, just like you said, concern yourself with an issue, address the issue. I think a lot of us should try to get our letters in
Yes.
and take care of that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Brother.
As you know, there's racism all over the world. And South Africa, they're going to make elect the first black leader. Do you think that the United States will take heed to what's going on, or they say when South Africa pass us in racial relations?
Okay, the question is South Africa going to surpass the United States in race relations? And I think that you're raising a very intriguing point, because in South Africa, the black majority is willing to follow some of the things that I talked about in my law review articles about respecting the importance of including the minority so that the government as a whole is seen as legitimate in the eyes of all of its citizens. And in that sense, it is more likely that a governing coalition can operate so that everyone works together and invests in the society because they believe that the rules are fair. And in that sense, and that would be a deeply ironic sense, South Africa may solve its race problem before the United States.
Yes, Dr. Lani, I'm not a law student, so I have not read most of your papers. But since you came to the spotlight, and I've heard your name quite frequently, and having come here and given us this wonderful speech, I've heard it, and now it occurs to me that your work in its totality is that you're trying to get the black people to realize economic and social equality with larger America. But throughout your speech, I did not hear anything about intra-racial problems that are in the way of achieving this equality with the larger population at large. What can you say about that?
Well, that's a good point, and I can't put everything in one speech. The comment was that there are also intra-racial problems that are operating to impede our efforts to overcome the 300, 400 years of slavery and its aftermath. And I think that that's true. I think part of what we need to do, though, is to start talking more about those problems. One of the problems that I see, a big problem that I see, has to do with our young black kids who are engaged in very violent behavior where you have black on black crime. Now, part of the problem as I see it is that a lot of these young black kids, and I'm using as a resource Elijah Anderson's book, Streetwise, which is a book about teenagers in Philadelphia. He interviewed and studied a number of black teenagers in Philadelphia. And he found that a lot of the young black men engage in what he called hyper-masculine behavior, violent behavior, again, as a way, just like those 6th grade kids, to gain status within their community, to gain a sense of respect and a sense of self-esteem, because the more traditional ways of establishing their, quote, manhood or masculinity have been denied them. They don't have access to a job. They don't have access to a livelihood. They don't have a sense of a future. They don't have the traditional ways of gaining status, and therefore, in a perverse but mirroring way, they take the larger culture and reproduce it in this hyper-masculine behavior. I think that's something we need to start talking about, because again, it's not about behavioral problems, aberrational behavioral problems about individuals. It's about people using the messages and the opportunities that they've been denied to make rational decisions within an irrational universe. I think we have to start talking about it, because I think that all of us have to start taking collective responsibility for what is going on. And again, it's not enough to point fingers and say who's right and who's wrong, but just to identify the connections and the ways in which we can do better. And I thank you for bringing that point up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to close on a note to remind you that, Medgar Evers is named after a man who had a particular kind of commitment to the democratic ideals of this country, and that the college itself has a responsibility to create the environment and the dialogue. And so it is a challenge for those of us who are here to talk about what happens, within the family, and then to talk about the externals as well. The article that appeared in the Sunday Times Magazine, some copies are in the Africana Resource Center. You should read it. Make sure you get a copy which fully explains Professor Guinier's odyssey, travails, and a lot of lessons in there for us. So it's our responsibility to get the information, but beyond that, to remember the Women's History Month theme, which is in every generation, action frees our dreams, and to see the dialogue process as very, very action-oriented, and as something that can begin the process of change. Thank you very much.